All right, off we go with our first test country, Great Britain. Constitutional. Great Britain has never had a written constitution. They will refer to a constitution, but it's a hypothetical constitution. And so instead, what they refer to as a constitution is a long list of acts of parliament, judicial pronouncements, customs conventions. It's effectively what you might call the law, generically the law. They would use the term constitution. So everything that's been done legally in the history of Great Britain that's in effect would be considered the Constitution, but they've never drafted a constitution like we have in the United States. Britain has a classic parliamentary regime. They are the inventors of the parliament system, which means their prime minister comes out of the parliament. There is no separate executive election. They have a socialist ideology or socialist-leaning ideology, kind of somewhere between full-fledged socialism and what we might consider a classical liberal ideology. So in other words, a lot of government regulation and a high degree of the welfare state, lots of state dollars being spent for social programs to make society more fair and equitable. Their economy is a mixed economy that definitely slants in the capitalist direction. Again, a lot of economic regulations and whatnot, and high taxes, but still the ability to own private property, have private businesses, with the expectation that it's going to be heavily regulated. Very stable and legitimate society in Great Britain. Of all of our countries, it is the most stable. And the main reason is because they've been able to maintain, by and large, at least with their English traditions, that the people with an English heritage have a common past and habit, and the traditions are very strong in Great Britain. Now, with that said, they are becoming multinational and multi-ethnic, and therefore things may be changing in terms of stability and their love for their tradition, royal family and whatnot. But even with that said, 1 out of 6 citizens said they would engage in civil disobedience, which is a sizable number. Their turnout rate is 70%, which is pretty solid. So this is all to say that we have a very stable and legitimate political system in Great Britain, a strong civil society, as we will see. And for the most part, they're not going to have a lot of upheaval. There may be some antisocial behavior. But by and large, they are stable, and people seek change through the traditional, ways of doing things, voting and engaging in political institutions. Now, there are exceptions in Great Britain. We have had terrorist activity from the Northern Irish before. Scotland tends to push the envelope politically, bordering on civil disobedience at times. But taken all together, in recent decades, Great Britain, very stable. Things are happening these days with things like Brexit, the Scottish independence vote. So we are seeing some cracks, but up to this point, definitely stable. Levels of government. Britain is a unitary government, which surprises a lot of people in that we kind of intuitively think of liberal democracies as being federal or at least decentralized to a degree, and it's really not fully true with Great Britain. They do have all of the power, virtually all the power, resting with the national government. However, you do have to remember that up until recent times, they've been a member of the European Union, which means that a lot of power has been handed over to the European Union. And then there's also devolution happening. So basically, the different nations within the Crown, Scotland, Wales, and then eventually Northern Ireland 10 years later, they begin demanding to have some more say on their local affairs. And so the English government or the British government allowed for them to have their own local parliaments. And so this is the epitome of devolution. They wanted to have more of a say about their own affairs. And then, of course, as I mentioned, 2014, Scotland rejected their referendum to secede from the kingdom. It was a very close vote, though. And in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, they may eventually decide to do that anyhow, along with possibly Northern Ireland as well. And so, like I said, lots of tradition, lots of stability, and legitimacy, but things are definitely changing for Great Britain as far as their identity and where their power is. So when we talk about executives, it gives us a perfect example in Britain of how we have two executives. One is driving policymaking and the other is the figurehead. In this case, the head of state is the crown, which is the queen, and they grant authority. The crown, the monarch, grants authority to the government. When you become prime minister, you have to request permission from the crown to run the government. And so therefore, yes, the monarch is above the prime minister, but basically sidesteps and gets out of the way and lets the prime minister do things after permission has been granted. Now, with that said also, the monarch does have some power if some really bad stuff goes down. But, in recent decades and centuries, the monarch more or less is kind of the fatherly or motherly figure of the English people by and large, and less so with the other nations. But the head of government is and the leader of the country is definitely the prime minister, which is often referred to as Downing Street, just like we refer to the United States president as the White House. Over there, it's Downing Street. And so in a parliamentary system, when an election takes place, whatever party controls the parliament is going to be able to elect their leader as the prime minister, which makes him or her the first among equals. But remember, a lot of times the party with the most seats doesn't have a majority, and they have to form a coalition with another party, usually one of the smaller parties. And basically they'll make some kind of agreement where the major party will get support for their prime minister, and in return, the smaller party will get some kind of policy agenda item. And the prime minister stays prime minister as long as he or she has a vote of confidence. So at any time, a vote of confidence for the prime minister can occur, and if they have lost support, then they would be withdrawn, and a new election for the parliament will take place. The cabinet, which is referred to as Westminster, is appointed by the prime minister from amongst the members of parliament. So these are called ministers, just like the American secretaries, and they head bureaucratic departments and hold the power of the purse over their respective departments. And then, of course, the most important of the Westminster positions is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the finance minister, more or less equivalent to the American Secretary of the Treasury. And so the cabinet is, again, unelected and appointed by someone else who is also unelected. But remember, this is much more about parliamentary systems and customs. And so when a party is in control of the House of Commons and they have their prime minister who then appoints his cabinet, then as long as they are successful and being able to maintain that vote of confidence and all these people hold their positions, as soon as that confidence vote falls through, the whole house of cards comes tumbling down and a new election takes place. The legislature in Great Britain is called the House of Commons, which is actually the lower house, just like the House of Representatives in America is the lower house. But in this case, the House of Lords, the upper house, is more of a fixture of tradition, and they don't do a whole lot. And so really that means the House of Commons is more or less the parliament. Whenever you hear the term parliament, this is who we're talking about. And so they voice policy concerns to the ministers on behalf of their constituents. So the cabinet and the prime minister are driving the agenda, trying to get bills passed through the House of Commons. And the House of Commons fight for their constituents. This is a liberal democracy, but they also play party politics to keep getting themselves reelected and in the good favor of the party. And most of the time they vote along party lines for that reason, 90% of the time, which is about the same as what it is in America. But if they do sense that a prime minister is becoming unpopular, they may break from voting along party lines and try to bring about a vote of no confidence, which is always a risky political game that has to be played. But once a bill can be passed, a minister must secure authorization from the Treasury, which is to say that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has to approve all the numbers, the fiscal numbers attached to any kind of bill, which gives them immense power. And then also, just like the United States Congress, the House of Commons provides oversight on the cabinet. So they would have investigations and hearings about anybody from that's in charge of the bureaucracy. Now, the House of Lords, as I said, is kind of a traditional body of the Parliament, and that is it's made up of hereditary members, and it's kind of like a retirement part of the retirement package for former remarkable members of the House of Commons. So you spend a whole career in the House of Commons, or maybe at some point you served in the cabinet or even prime minister. You could kind of kick back in your later years as the House of Lords. Right now there are 792 House of Lords seats. And they introduce non-controversial legislation. They may revise or amend bills from the House of Commons, but they don't typically do so in any kind of controversial manner. There are 792 seats compared to the 650 in the House of Commons. So, again, bicameral legislature, but for kind of a different reason than what we see in the United States. It's more or less a unicameral legislature as far as policymaking goes. Elections in Great Britain function similarly to the way they do in America, but because of their parliamentary system and the makeup of Great Britain, meaning these different nations that exist, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, because they have these separate identities, weird things can happen. So an election must occur once every 5 years, but a prime minister can call a new election at any time. There's political reasons why he or she might do that. It could be a threat. It could be packaged with a bill that they're trying to get through. There's lots of reasons why that might happen. But in the House of Commons, we have districts, just like we have in the United States, which means they have first-past-the-post elections, or single-member district plurality. One does not have to live in the district they represent, however, which is one key difference with America. But they do have 650 districts, each with a single member representative. In some elections, the party with the most national votes does not win the most seats. And there are reasons why that can happen. Nationalist parties win in their respective nations. So there are Northern Irish parties and Scottish parties and Welsh parties that win in those places because their seats are concentrated. On the other hand, we have national parties like the UK Independence Party, which is called UKIP. And in 2015, they won 13% of the popular vote, which is third most. But because their representation, or support, I should say, is scattered throughout all of Great Britain, they only ended up winning one seat. So despite having 13% of the vote, they only wound up with 0.0015% of the seats. Which is really, sort of unfair. Now, proponents of the first-past-the-post system point to the efficiency of single-party control. Like I said, if one party controls the House of Commons, then that means they get all the executive channels as well. And you don't get the gridlock that you get in the American system, where you could very well have the White House and Congress from different parties, and they can't really agree on things. We also have a national referenda in Great Britain that we don't have in America. In 2011, they actually put it on the ballot as a national referendum as to whether they should ditch the first-past-the-post system because of these parties like UKIP or the Liberal Democratic Party that's winning sizable chunks of the vote. But because their support is scattered, they only wind up with a couple of seats. But the British people soundly rejected a change to a proportional election system. So here are some of the parties that I mentioned already. The major parties that we have in Britain are Labour, which is a center-left party, mainly pro-union, as you would expect. And then you have the Conservative Party, which would be center-right, although it would be more liberal than the American equivalent of the Republican Party. And they tend to be a little more pro-business, a little less socialist. The Liberal Democratic Party would be to the far left and is more or less a socialist party. And they have had years where they were pretty successful. They are, kind of seen as a third party at this point, and some people, when they have a good year, would consider them we would have a three-party system. But as we've learned about the first past the post system, you can really only have two dominant parties. And Liberal Democrats in recent years have kind of fallen down a little bit. In fact, UKIP has got more votes than they did in the last election. Then you got the nationalist parties from the regional areas. And so Sinn Féin is the Northern Irish party. Plaid Cymru is the Welsh party that sometimes calls for independence of Wales, and the Scottish National Party, and so on. And so they'll win a couple of seats because all their support is concentrated inside of districts, and they can pull off victories. Elite recruitment is another thing that we need to mention at this stage, and that is, how do you elevate your way through the government? Because like in most countries, you get yourself elected to the legislature, you probably have higher ambitions. And in Britain, you want to be the prime minister, or at the very least be a cabinet member or a high-ranking minister. And to do that, you start off in parliament, whereas in other countries you may have to be a military person or an academic. And those things probably don't hurt in Great Britain, but you get yourself elected to the House of Commons, and then once you're in there, as with other liberal democracies, re-election is almost certain because of the incumbent's advantage. And then you do a few years there, and then you start working on trying to move your way up into the cabinet, and then back into a higher level position in parliament maybe, and then maybe you go for the prime ministership down the road. So elite recruitment, how you work your way up the ranks, is an important question to ask, especially when it comes to party politics. Now, in the United Kingdom, we definitely need to mention the bureaucracy. It is a massive bureaucracy. And it makes sense because we're talking about a welfare state that where the government is seeking to promote equality in society, and they feel like the best way to do that via a socialist ideology is to do it through government agencies. And so huge number of government agencies and bureaucracies and offices, and there's also a lot of turnover as well. And this is also common in a bureaucratic state where people are constantly trying to move up the ladder to a higher position. So executive agencies that, we see this in the United States as well, where people have a lot of power. There's a lot of big code books of regulations, what we might call red tape. And these are non-elected people, and so we get to this whole foggy bottom of the huge bureaucracy and the labyrinth that exists within it. But people in the United Kingdom have come to really appreciate and love their public services, those that are administered by the state. And so at various points in British history since World War II, we've seen the government take over a lot of sectors of the economy, a lot of industries, to more extend services, promote equality and fairness and all that. And the place where we can see this the most is the National Health Service, which is revered by the people in the United Kingdom for providing universal health coverage, meaning the government pays every dime of the medical bills for all citizens. And it's very expensive, very bureaucratic, lots of rules and regulations, lots of wait times. Anytime you have universal health care, you have lots and lots of people on the health rolls, but not always the available services. It's hard to get certain kinds of procedures and surgeries. Doctors aren't always available. Beds aren't even always available. So there tends to be wait times. But nonetheless, this is what you get when you are pursuing a welfare state. Yeah, you can always say that people having their needs met, but you also have a lot of wait times. And that's the way the Brits have decided for things to be, as they kind of rejected their global platform, their imperial platform, and moved more toward internal domestic policy. We also got Quangos in the UK, which are these institutions that kind of function like GSEs in the United States, like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Farmer Mac. which were these government banks that were established by Congress and then turned loose to operate themselves. Parliament has done the same kind of thing uh, by addressing certain policy areas to deliver public services more effectively. So they created these institutions and they turned them over to themselves. And and so they're appointed by these cabinet ministers. They're appropriated by the treasury, but they kind of operate themselves. Remember, these are quasi non-government organizations, so interest groups that kind of have a connection to government, but not fully, not to the full extent of, say, an executive agency and bureaucracy. But they all kind of do the same work, which is to say there's lots of government personnel and quasi-government personnel that are delivering policy and services to the public. In 2005, Parliament created a new court system, which is called the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and they're in charge of hearing all civil cases. So what we might call in the United States constitutional cases or civil liberties cases, you would hear those in the Supreme Court of the UK. So they also hear all criminal cases in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Scotland has its own criminal court. It also hears cases involving devolution. So lots of things kind of floating around with the courts here. Now, up until Brexit is implemented, the United Kingdom is also subject to rulings by the European Union's Court of Justice. And this is on more human rights stuff, civil rights and some civil liberties, things that are bound to be done through the European Union treaties. Now, Great Britain has voted to break from Brexit, which is going to release them from these obligations, and therefore they're going to have to address their judiciary issues once they have fully separated from the European Union. Britain has a pluralist system, which means that groups fairly compete. They voice the concerns of the people who try to make their voices louder by bonding with people that have the same interests. And interest groups and labor unions and things in the post-war era were very strong and becoming very powerful. But since the 70s, they've been weakening. And Margaret Thatcher, as prime minister in the 80s, instituted the so-called arm's length policy, which is to really diminish the role of unions, especially in Great Britain. The same thing has kind of happened in the United States. Union membership way down, and their ability to influence policy is way down too, but they're still around and still influential. We do have business groups that lobby to support conservatives and lower taxes, reduce regulations, and all the things that businesses tend to fight for. Now let's take a look at society and how it functions both in terms of being connected to the government and being separate from the government. So with political culture, you got lots of different nuances because of this four nations, one state scenario. So for example, when you talk about identity, the English and the Northern Irish consider themselves to be the most British. Clearly the English, even the Northern Irish, are kind of getting their own identity, maybe even moving closer to Ireland and having their identity be Irish as opposed to British. But if you go over to Scotland, they would be much more likely to consider themselves Scottish. And Welsh consider themselves Welsh, and so on. And people, you got this whole plethora of identities that you have in the United Kingdom, and it speaks to how close the nation is connected to, any one of the four nations is connected to the state, based on how they identify themselves. Government secrecy remains high in Great Britain. There is corruption, but definitely not to the degree that we're going to see in, say, Russia or China or Iran. Most Brits do distrust the government, but it also speaks to the idea that they have a long liberal democratic tradition. And when we say distrust, it's not necessarily full-fledged corruption that they are suspecting, but maybe that the government is not fully invested in the people's wishes. But most Brits do believe that government should do basic things, that they should provide education, healthcare, social care. Again, this is a welfare state. And so many people do have a connection to the government either by voting or contributing or volunteering, but it's a much higher level than in many other places. So they have a strong political culture, if not one that is critical of its government. Political socialization in the UK comes from a couple of different sources. Religion is not really too big of an issue these days in the mostly secular United Kingdom. Um, this is true except for in Northern Ireland, where there's still the remnants of a really intense Catholic Protestant fight that had been going on for centuries. Um, Now, we do have to mention the Anglican Church, what here in America we would call the Episcopalian Church, and it is state supported, meaning tax dollars do go to it. And it does tend to provide some socialization for those that are regular or even semi regular attenders. But it's such a blurry line between church and state in the United Kingdom that not only will you get spiritual socialization, but you'll also get the Anglican Church kind of moving into the area of politics a lot of times. We're going to see the exact same thing in Russia with the Russian Orthodox Church, who's kind of made a deal with the government to promote patriotism. So you kind of get the same kind of thing there. But by far, the biggest socializer for political opinions in the UK is class. You have a thriving middle class in a advanced Western democracy. That doesn't it's not really surprising. But middle class people and affluent people tend to vote with more conservative opinions, while the working class and the lower working class and the poor are going to vote more for labor. Again, no surprise there. It's very close to what you're going to find in the United States. But class is definitely something that comes up quite a bit. With participation, voter registration is automatic. However, just like we see in the United States, people don't always have the urgency, the sense of urgency to go out and vote. But 77% average turnout since 1950, down in more recent years, but that's still pretty high for a voluntary voting system. And you can see, lastly, that only 10% are actively involved in politics. And that kind of goes back to the political culture numbers that I gave you before. People are distrustful of the government. They kind of got a bad taste in their mouth. They like the institution. They revere the traditions of the liberal democracy and also the kingdom. But only 10% really are going to be heavily involved, actively involved in politics. And that means that they are devoting most of their time to civic stuff that's going to make them happy and that is more important to them. And now for the aforementioned civil society. It is very strong in the United Kingdom. Again, you're going to see this most of the time in liberal democratic nations with advanced industries, and it's definitely true in the United Kingdom. So lots of clubs, professional sports, obviously the Premier League soccer is world renowned. A very thriving entertainment industry, both in terms of cinema, television, music. There is a strong sense of nationalism, separate from the government. I mean, the British tradition of the English people, particularly, there's a lot of traditionalism, and it kind of moves into the political culture as well. When you have a royal wedding like we've had recently, people just love that stuff. And it does kind of hint at that they respect the institutions, the traditions of the monarchy, but also the democratic systems that they've had in place for so long. But it's also a nationalistic thing. It is part of the British and especially English traditional landscape. And so there is a big sense of their values of the people that we see in the UK. And that's true of all four nations in their own unique ways as well. Like I said, religion before traditionally has been an important aspect of the civil society, but these days Protestantism tends to be the most dominant form of Christianity, which is the most common religion in the UK. There is a strong element of Catholicism for those that regularly attend religious institution, like in Northern Ireland. Half Catholic, half Protestant. Those disputes have been common. In recent years, it's kind of dimmed down in the last 10 years or so. But again, anytime we look at religion, we have to ask ourselves, in the UK, is it really about political culture? Are you being indoctrinated by the church to be good citizens, since it's a tax-supported church? Or is it part of the civil society, where you voluntarily are getting your spiritual feeding from the church separately from what the government's trying to feed you? So interesting questions. But all in all of our countries that we're going to look at, religion in the UK is probably the most minimal of importance compared to the other countries. Newspapers tend to slant politically and serve the elite, while tabloid papers sell in great numbers to the masses. So, newspapers, just like in America, will align themselves politically, whether it be on the conservative side or the liberal side. TV is the same way. TV, here's the interesting thing about Great Britain, is that they are government controlled. The BBC has a monopoly on all TV news and TV programming. In fact, you go to Britain, it's BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Three. Those are all your channels. But they've been amazingly have been able to violate the rules of government-run media, which is to say it hasn't become a total propaganda machine. It's by and large been allowed to kind of do its own thing. They have laws in place to kind of guard against the government using TV for political gain to a corrupt or overbearing degree. So laws forbid stations from selling advertising for political ads. They actually will serve as watchdogs on the government. But of course, government does control your licensing, so you can't go too far on that. But it's been really amazing that they haven't gone overboard. With that said, news is very political, one way or the other, in Britain. But they have resisted the urge to allow government to take the whole thing over. Cleavages in Great Britain, there are a couple that we could point to. One that's becoming less urgent is the Northern Irish separatist movement. So the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, a few decades ago was really in the news quite a bit and was a major concern for their off and on threats of breaking from Great Britain and for their terrorist activity and for their religious stress. And so, the original reason why they came into the United Kingdom was to spread Protestantism to the Irish island. And nowadays, that's just not so much of an issue. And so we've had flare-ups over the years. In the recent decade or so, things have calmed down with Northern Ireland. In the aftermath of Brexit, they may very well vote to leave and join Ireland in the near future. So we'll see what happens with that. But what's far more urgent is Scotland and their relationship with England as being part of of Great Britain, and to a lesser degree Wales as well. Most people think Wales and England will probably stick together for the long term. We'll see. And in modern times, definitely the growing Muslim minority is an issue that leads to a lot of people talking about some of the tension that goes along with immigration. In fact, this was one of the driving forces for Brexit, was the Conservatives' insistence that the British government deal with being a little more regulatory on refugees coming in from Mideast countries. And the European Union largely ignored that, and that's why Brexit went down, at least for partially. And so, a country that had for hundreds of years been homogeneous, of Anglican ethnicity and culture and tradition, Christian and religion, and democratic and all these things. And these things are starting to change since 9/11, with different people groups making it a multinational, multi-religious state. And that has definitely caused a lot of tension. Now, Great Britain's been around for centuries, of course, and so there's been lots of social movements, revolutions, and coups along the way. The first one we should mention would be the formation of Great Britain. So what is Great Britain? Well, Great Britain is basically an island. It's a geographical term that refers to England, Scotland, and Wales, but it also refers to a kingdom. And so England, Scotland, and Wales is the kingdom of Great Britain. We also have Northern Ireland, which is not part of Great Britain, but it is part of the United Kingdom, which is to say the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland joined together in 1801. It can get quite confusing. Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom, but had broke from the crown in 1921. So you used to have the Kingdom of Great Britain, which is one island, the Kingdom of Ireland, which is the other island. Ireland broke away, Northern Ireland stayed behind. And now, of course, you may see Northern Ireland rejoining Ireland in the near future, which would leave just Great Britain, and there would be no more United Kingdom. And then, of course, if Scotland and or Wales breaks away, you wouldn't have a Kingdom of Great Britain either. You would simply have an island of Great Britain and no longer a kingdom. And then there's the other one that you could also mention, was the British Isles, which is both of the islands together. So there's all kinds of people that or kinds of terminology that will drive Americans crazy. But you take some time, you can get it all sorted out. Another social movement is the development of the welfare state since World War II. So you got to remember, the British Empire was the dominant force in the world for hundreds of years. And then the world wars really freaked them all out. And they decided, we don't want to have a global empire anymore. We just want to take care of ourselves. And so the Labour government that took power after the war paved the way for this Keynesian welfare state. They established the National Health Service, other socialist economic policies. They nationalized major industries, which means to put them under government control. And that's the way they rolled all the way up until the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, who's basically the British female version of Ronald Reagan. And they basically said, the socialist mentality has destroyed our economy, made us uncompetitive, put too much reliance on the government, and therefore we need to pursue more free market policies, reduce the size of government, abandon Keynesian government spending policies, of everything that happens in the United States under Reaganomics. And that carries on all the way into the mid-90s, when the new Labor Party, which would be the equivalent of the Clinton era. Tony Blair is the British Bill Clinton, which is to say a new leftist party that has some more conservative elements. But the welfare state is kind of gets back on track again and reestablishes itself with a few more smaller government institutions. So the Labor Party in the 90s tries to play it both ways. And that takes us all the way up to 9/11, where they've been kind of back and forth, just like the United States has been. Another one that we should mention as far as revolutions, Northern Ireland did attempt to break from the UK violently in 2002. They were subdued and kind of put on probation until 2007, when they were causing other issues. And so Northern Ireland has long been kind of a thorn in the side of Great Britain, even though they're part of it. And at one time it was incredibly important for them to be a part of it, but now those days are over. And so we ask the question, why in the heck is Northern Ireland still part of this whole thing? Political and economic change, so more of kind of the same stuff we were mentioning. Thatcher, again, swung the country into a more capitalist-leaning economy in the 1980s. So she deprivatized or privatized a lot of the institutions that government had taken over in the post-war era, which reduced the strain of the people in terms of taxation and regulatory rules, and unleashed the economy to be more productive and more competitive. In the 90s, again, the Labor government tried to launch nationalization, but it kind of didn't really get there, and so they resorted to socialism and lots of regulations on those industries. 2016, citizens voted to leave the European Union, which was dubbed Brexit, or the exit of Britain from the European Union. But if you look at the electoral map for Brexit, it was very patchy. In some places you had overwhelming support for staying in the European Union. In other places you had overwhelming support for leaving. And in those places that wanted to stay, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they're kind of being overruled by the majority here, but that does signal that they may eventually break from the United Kingdom. And so that whole story is kind of still being written, and we'll see where it goes. it's going to take a couple of years before Brexit is executed. If it even happens, there are forces that may try to step in and prevent that from happening. So where does Britain go from here? Well, like we said, the British Empire dominated the world for hundreds of years, and then after the World Wars, they decided, well, I just want to be a small country. And only 49% of Brits continue to favor that. After Brexit, are they going to maintain a relationship with the European Union, even though they're not going to be members? What about their relationship with the United States or with the Commonwealth states like Canada and Australia? The future is very murky for Great Britain. It could be good or bad, just as far as what's their role going to be, what's their identity going to be. Scotland, Northern Ireland, we just have no guarantees. Where do we go with the welfare state? The welfare state is very strained. And people love the institutions, people love the goodies that they get, but it also puts a tremendous strain on them. As far as coming up with the dollars and extracting that wealth from the people and making them less competitive on global markets. And so there's lots of factors. But most people do rely on these programs, education, healthcare. A lot of people have their jobs with the government working in the welfare state. And so you kind of have to pick your poison here. Do you like what you're getting versus do you wish you could have something different? And people need to figure these things out. Taxes obviously play a major role in that decision making. And then the whole multicultural question, which has been partially answered now with Brexit, because there is a signal through that decision and that referendum that the British people do want to maintain some of their traditional identity in the face of growing multiculturalism and immigration. And so that it's far from being decided what they view. Remember, only half the country, just over half, said yes to Brexit. And so now, who knows if the majorities will continue or they will continue moving toward a multiculturalism direction. Crime is on the rise as well, partially because of multiculturalism, partially from other factors, which could be anything about social policy or tax policy or urban development policy, but whatever it is, crime is on the rise. And so lots of uncertainty for Britain. Moving forward, we could be on the brink of another golden age. We could be on the brink of them completely losing the identity of the Great Britain that we all know, and only time will tell.